Hello Revolution students and welcome back to another video on the Russian Revolution Area Study 1. In this video I'm going to look at the Red and White Terror, the new topic that has been added to the 2022 study design. We used to just study the Red Terror. Well, we're going to study the White Terror as well from now on. And in this video it's going to be part 1 of this series, and I'm just going to look at the Red Terror. In the second video I'll look at the White Terror. So let us get into it. Okay, so let's have a look. What was Lenin's attitudes towards the terror? Well, he thought it was necessary. He'd always accepted the necessity of the terror in order to consolidate Bolshevik political authority in Russia. He knew there was going to be resistance to the Bolsheviks taking power, and the terror was going to be one means of imposing the Bolshevik will upon the population. Some key quotes about his attitude towards the terror. So the first one: surely you do not imagine that we shall be victorious without applying the most cruel revolutionary terror. And the second one: it is necessary secretly and urgently to prepare the terror, and on Tuesday we will decide whether it will be through Sovnarkom or otherwise. And you could use those two quotes if you are having to answer a question about the terror and you're focusing upon Lenin's attitude. Let us keep going. So the Cheka itself. The Cheka was a state police that was modelled upon the former Tsarist police, the Okhrana, and it was formed in December 1917. The head of the Cheka was, you can see there, Dzerzhinsky. And Felix Dzerzhinsky, and he was an intellectual of Polish background. He was a noble and he was a fanatical Bolshevik. The Cheka is a prime example of Bolshevik ruthlessness. Ruthlessness being that they would do anything to hold on to power regardless of the morality of their actions. The purpose of the Cheka was to destroy counter-revolutionaries, and it was a broad term that included class enemies and members of other revolutionary or political groups. And the Cheka itself had unlimited powers of arrest, detention, and torture in order to get the information that they needed, or to persecute those enemies of the people. And finally, there is your key stat there. So, and I took this from Alpha History. The Cheka had about 2,000 people employed in it. Okay, let us keep going. So the Cheka continued. So as I said before, the Cheka aided the Bolsheviks in consolidating and defending their political authority in Russia. It played a key role in the Civil War. It was the group that instituted the Red Terror, or prosecuted it, along with war communism and grain requisitioning. War communism and grain requisitioning being economic aspects of the terror, but also there was the political aspect of the terror, which we're going to look at later. And a prime example of that political aspect was executing political opponents, and probably the most famous example of a political opponent executed was the Tsar and his family in July 1918. They also ran labour camps to incarcerate enemies of the revolution, and there were 315 by Lenin's death in 1924. An easy stat to remember and a great one to support your arguments about the role played by the Cheka post-revolution in Russia. And here is a nice quote from Dzerzhinsky. Do not demand evidence to prove that the prisoner has opposed the Soviet government. Your first duty is to ask him to which class he belongs. What are his origins? These questions should decide the fate of the prisoner. So Dzerzhinsky is pretty much saying there, it doesn't matter whether the prisoner is innocent or guilty, if he is a class enemy, if he is a capitalist, or if he is a kulak, then he is guilty because of his class affiliation and should be punished as such. Let us keep going. So the decree on the establishment of the Extraordinary Commission to fight counter-revolution established the Cheka. And here it is here. and it was passed in December 1917. The duties of the commission will be to 1. To persecute and break up all acts of counter-revolution and sabotage all over Russia, no matter what their origin. 2. To bring before the Revolutionary Tribunal all counter-revolutionists and saboteurs and to work out a plan for fighting them. The commission is to watch the press, saboteurs, strikers, and the social revolutionists of the right. Measures to be taken against these counter-revolutionists are confiscation, confinement, deprivation of food cards, publication of the names of the enemies of the people, etc., etc. Okay, so as I spoke about before, there was the political terror, the political aspect to the Red Terror. Lenin personally ordered the Cheka to murder the ex-Tsar Nicholas II and his family in July 1918. Shortly after the murder, Jasinski told the press, "The Cheka is the defense of the revolution as the Red Army is. As in the Civil War, the Red Army cannot stop to ask whether it may harm in particular individuals, but must take into account only one thing, the victory of the revolution over the bourgeoisie. So the Cheka must defend the revolution and conquer the enemy, even if its sword falls occasionally on the heads of the innocent." So I think what he might be alluding to there is the murder of innocent people, in particular, not only the Tsar himself, but his wife, his daughters, and his son. And Jasinski is saying there that those innocent murders are justified in order to defend the revolution. Let's keep going. Further aspects of the political terror. So it waged class warfare against both the bourgeoisie and rich peasants, the kulaks. And we'll see grain requisitioning below. As we spoke about before, the labour camps themselves were a key aspect of this political terror. Many people were put, many political opponents were put into these labour camps. In conjunction with these labour camps, show trials were also run from April to August 1922, and members of outlaw political parties and the Moscow clergy were persecuted during these trials. It is estimated that over 100,000 people were executed during the Red Terror, and I got that stat from Alpha History, so you can go and have a look there if you wish. A great stat to support your discussion of the terror in the exam, if there is a question about the Red Terror in the exam this year. And then there's another nice quote from Jasinski. So Jasinski declared the revolution could not be saved except by exterminating the enemies of the working class. Okay, let us now have a look at the economic terror. And the key aspect of the economic terror was war communism. And although war communism was introduced to overcome the economic challenges created by the Civil War, such as feeding the Red Army, it was also introduced to wage economic warfare against class enemies. The two class enemies being the capitalists, bourgeoisie, and the kulaks, rich peasants. Key policies of war communism were the Decree on Nationalisation, which was passed on the 28th of June 1918, and it nationalised industry and it took the wealth away from the capitalists, transferring this wealth to the state. And the second key policy of war communism was grain requisitioning, which we've spoken about before. Grain requisitioning began in July 1918, and it involved Cheka units going out into the countryside and forcibly taking grain from the peasants. As is understandable, the peasants themselves weren't too happy about their grain being taken from them. So there are a number of uprisings, perhaps the most famous being the Tambov uprising of 1920, went right through to 21-22, where over 20,000 peasants insurrected against Bolshevik rule. And we can see there the peasants resisting. And the Bolsheviks, rather than blaming the peasants, they blame the rich peasants, the kulaks, and they accuse the kulaks of hoarding grain so as to make huge profits. So hoarding, so keeping grain, not selling it, so the price of grain went up, and then selling it when the price was a lot higher and making a bigger profit. As a consequence, the Bolsheviks murdered many kulaks. On the 11th of August 1918, Lenin wrote, Comrades, the uprising by the 5 kulak volosts must be mercilessly suppressed. The interest of the entire revolution demands this, for we are now facing everywhere the final decisive battle with the kulaks. We need to set an example. You need to hang without fail, so that the people see no fewer than 100 of the notorious kulaks, the rich and the bloodsuckers. So, by killing 100, murdering 100 kulaks, it was setting an example for all the other peasants to follow, to do what the Bolsheviks told them to do. Okay, let us keep going. Some historical interpretations of the Red Terror. The first one is from Pipes, and he writes, the majority of the Red Terror's victims were hostages chosen at random, mainly because of their social background, wealth, or connections with the old regime. The Bolsheviks considered these massacres necessary not only to suppress concrete threats to their regime, but also to intimidate the citizens and force them into psychic submission. So in summary, Pipes is arguing that the Bolsheviks instituted the Red Terror to kill counter-revolutionaries and protect the regime, but also to make the population subservient. Our next historical interpretation is from Fige, and he writes, historians have tended to neglect the connections between this plebeian war on privilege and the origins of the Red Terror. Most of them have seen the terror as exclusively political. Neither is a satisfactory explanation. The terror erupted from below. It was an integral element of the social revolution from the start. The Bolsheviks encouraged but did not create this mass terror. So Fige has a slightly different interpretation to Pipes. So he's arguing that the Bolsheviks encouraged the Red Terror but didn't necessarily create it, and that the terror began from below amongst the people. It was caused by the masses and was a part of the revolution itself. Okay, that is my video on the Red Terror. I hope it has been useful for your study of the Russian Revolution, Area of Study 2, and I shall see you next time. Goodbye.